screaming under a fallen slab of rock in Forbidden Canyon country, a young Apache woman fought to survive, and finding her would change his life forever. The same night Gideon's mare had bolted into the dark and led him straight to her, with armed riders already closing in to finish what the rockslide had started. This was Arizona territory in the autumn of 1883, high desert country where a man's whole fortune could walk off in a single night and never be seen again unless he was willing to ride further than sense allowed. Gideon Cole had built 9 years of trust with the chestnut stallion he'd named Cavalier, and when the horse vanished from a locked corral without so much as a broken rail to explain it, every instinct he owned made plain that this was no accident and no wandering. What began as a rancher chasing hoofprints into Forbidden Canyon country would end with Gideon kneeling in the dust beside a Chiricahua Apache woman named Ayasha, the chief's own daughter, choosing in the space of one held breath whether to walk away from a stranger's danger or make it his own. And before the sun set on that country again, 6 armed riders would learn exactly what it cost a man to hunt a woman who had an entire nation watching over her. Stay with this one to the end, because what Gideon found in that canyon didn't just save a woman's life, it rewrote the rest of his own. And if stories like this one are the reason you keep coming back, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more Wild West love stories. The ranch Gideon ran sat 2 hours' ride from the little crossing town of Cottonwood Bend, a spread he'd built up alone since his father passed him the deed at 22, along with one plain conviction, delivered the way the old man delivered everything. That land only belonged to a man willing to bleed for it. Gideon had bled for it. He had broken his own horses rather than pay a man to do it, had ridden fence line through blizzards that put lesser ranchers in their beds for a week after, had turned down 2 separate offers of marriage from perfectly fine women in town because he could never quite explain, even to himself, why neither of them made him feel the way the open country did at first light. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and content enough with it that his foreman Otis had long since stopped teasing him about it, mostly because the teasing never landed anywhere close to a nerve worth hitting. Gideon had grown up on that same stretch of ground, learning the shape of every draw and dry wash before he learned much else. And the ranch he'd inherited had taught him early that the desert forgave almost nothing and rewarded only the patient. He kept his own books, mended his own tack, and had earned enough of a name across 3 counties for square dealing that buyers rode past 2 closer outfits just to trade with him instead. He was not a man given to idle talk in town, preferring the company of good horses and honest work to an evening spent trading gossip at the mercantile. And the few times he had let himself imagine a different kind of life, a house with more voices in it than his own and Otis's, the picture had always stayed vague and unfinished, more a feeling than a plan, until the morning everything changed shape without warning. Cavalier was the one extravagance Gideon had ever allowed himself. He'd bought the colt off a Sonoran horse trader 9 years back for a price that made Otis whistle through his teeth. A deep chestnut with a white blaze and a stride that ate up rough ground like it was nothing, and the 2 of them had covered more miles together than Gideon had covered with any human being he could name. Cavalier had carried him through river crossing that should have drowned a lesser horse, had stood steady under gunfire once when rustlers hit the herd 2 winters back, had never once in 9 years wandered further than the length of his picket rope on his own. So when Otis came pounding on the bunkhouse door before first light hollering that the corral gate stood open and Cavalier was nowhere on the place, Gideon was dressed and out the door before the older man finished the sentence. The corral gate hadn't been broken. It had been unlatched, deliberate and clean, and the ground beyond it laid out a story Gideon didn't like the shape of at all. A single set of cavalier's tracks leading off toward the rocky hill country to the east, moving at a walk, not a run, the gait of an animal being led rather than an animal spooked. Two of the hands leaned toward horse thieves working the Cottonwood Bend Road. A third, older and more superstitious, grumbled about wildcats and wouldn't be argued out of it, even when Gideon pointed out that no wildcat unlatches a gate and closes it soft behind itself. Gideon kept his own counsel and voiced no opinion of his own, because the truth sitting cold in his gut was simpler and worse than either theory. Somebody had wanted that horse gone quietly enough that nobody heard a thing, and a man didn't go to that kind of trouble over an animal he meant to keep for himself. He saddled his bay gelding, a steady, sure-footed animal named Samson, packed 2 days of jerky and hardtack more out of habit than plan, and rode east before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Otis wanted to send a hand along, and Gideon refused him flat, explaining only that if trouble was waiting out there, he'd rather it found one man than two, and that the ranch needed every other hand it had for the roundup already underway. It was not entirely honesty. Some part of Gideon simply preferred to meet whatever this was on his own terms, the way he preferred to meet most things. And Otis, who had worked for the Cole family long enough to know when arguing was wasted breath, only warned him to be back by dark and looked considerably less than convinced that he would be. The tracks held steady and easy to read for the first several miles, cutting a straight line toward the broken hill country that rose up brown and jagged against the eastern sky, ground most Cottonwood Bend folks avoided on principle. It was Chiricahua land by long custom, if not by any paper the territory recognized, and the stories that circulated in town about it were the usual mixture of half-truth and pure invention, vanished travelers, ambushes that never happened quite the way the tellers claimed. A general unspoken agreement that a white rancher had no particular business riding in uninvited. Gideon had heard all of it over the years and believed almost none of it, mostly because the two Apache traders he'd dealt with fairly at the Cottonwood Bend trading post had struck him as considerably more honest than half the white men he did business with, and he was not about to let a saloon story turn him back from a horse that had carried him faithfully for 9 years. Near midday, he came on a spring tucked between two shoulders of pale rock, water clear enough to see straight to the gravel bottom, and there the tracks made plain that he'd guessed right about at least one thing. Cavalier's hoofprints ring the spring's edge, only hours old by the sharpness of their impression in the damp sand, and moving off from them, half obscured but unmistakable if a man knew what he was looking at, a second set of prints, lighter, human, barefooted or near enough to it, heading toward a narrow gap in the rock that opened onto country darker and tighter than anything Gideon had ridden through yet. He sat his horse at the mouth of that canyon a long moment, weighing the sense of turning back for help against the plain fact that whatever was in there had his horse, and decided the way he decided most things, that he'd rather find out for himself than wonder the rest of his life. The canyon swallowed the sunlight almost as soon as he rode into it, walls rising close and sheer on either side, until the sky above narrowed to a pale seam a man could have covered with two hands held together. The quiet in there had weight to it, the kind of silence that made a rider strain his ears without meaning to, and Samson's ears stayed pinned forward the whole way in, reading something in the air Gideon couldn't name yet, but trusted his horse enough to believe. They'd gone perhaps a quarter-mile deeper when Samson stopped dead of his own accord. Forelegs planted, head up, and Gideon heard it too in the same instant. A sound low and ragged, unmistakably human. Someone fighting hard for breath through what sounded like real pain. He came around a shoulder of fallen boulders and found her there, wedged between two slabs of stone that had clearly come down together in some long-ago slide. One massive shard pinning her lower leg at an angle that turned Gideon's stomach just to look at. She was young, dark-haired, dressed in doe skin work with beadwork that marked her plainly as no wanderer, but someone's daughter, someone's kin. And the moment his shadow crossed her face, her hand shot to the small knife at her belt with a speed that left no doubt of her meaning. She would rather die fighting than be taken by surprise by whatever had found her. Gideon stopped where he stood and raised both hands slow, palms open, the same gesture he'd have used, gentling a spooked colt. "Easy." He kept his voice low and even, hands still raised. "I am not here to hurt you. I'm only looking for my horse, and I heard you." He nodded toward the rock pinning her leg. "That looks like it's crushing you worse by the minute." She studied him a long, wary moment, knife never lowering, pain plain across her face even as she held perfectly still against it. Her English, when it finally came, was careful and precise, the accent of someone who'd learned it deliberately rather than been born to it. "You are alone." "I am." He crouched slow, well back from her, and nodded at the rock again. "That's not going anywhere on its own, and neither are you. I mean to help you move it, if you'll let me." She didn't answer that directly, only shifted her grip on the knife a fraction looser, which Gideon took, correctly, as the only permission he was likely to get. He cast around the canyon floor until he found a fallen branch thick and long enough to serve as a lever, wedged one end beneath the lip of the shard, pinning her leg, and set his shoulder against the other with every ounce of weight he owned. The stone did not want to move. It fought him the way stone always fights a man who thinks his strength alone will be enough. And Gideon strained against that branch until his vision swam at the edges, until a sound tore out of him that was half curse and half prayer, and the rock shifted just barely, just enough. "Now," he ground the word out through his teeth, "pull free now while it's giving." She wrenched her leg loose in the same instant the stone settled back, with a grinding thud that would have taken her foot clean off had she been a half-second slower, and the two of them sat there afterward in the canyon's close quiet, both breathing hard, Gideon's shoulders screaming where the branch had near dislocated it, and her leg free at last but plainly ruined for walking any distance. For a moment neither of them moved at all, the echo of the settling stone still rolling off the canyon walls above them. And Gideon found his hands were shaking in a way they hadn't during the lift itself, the fear catching up to him only once the danger had passed. He had felt that branches start to slip twice in the effort, had known plainly that a second failed attempt might have cost him the strength to try a third. And it was only now, watching her drag air into her lungs in ragged, grateful pulls, that the full weight of how close it had come settled into his chest. She noticed his hands too, her gaze flicking briefly to them, and something almost gentle crossed her face, the first softening he'd seen in her since the knife came out. Her ankle had swollen already to twice its size, the boot laced around it torn where the stone's edge had caught it, and blood ran thin from a gash along her shin that she pressed her palm against with the flat, practiced calm of someone who'd tended far worse wounds than her own before. Gideon dug a clean cloth from his saddlebag along with his canteen and held both out to her rather than reaching for her himself, letting her take what she wanted at whatever pace she trusted. She poured water over the gash first, cleaning it with a care that showed plainly she knew exactly what she was doing, and only after that took a slow, careful sip for herself, watching him over the canteen's rim the whole time, the way a person watches an animal they haven't decided whether to trust. "I'm Gideon." He held the canteen a moment longer than the moment strictly needed, filling the silence before it could turn awkward. "Gideon Cole. My ranch sits west of here, 2 hours out past Cottonwood Bend." She considered that a moment before answering, as though weighing what a name cost to give away. "Ayasha." It came slow, like she'd measured the price of it first. Ayasha. He tried the name careful, wanting to get it right the first time, rather than mangle it the way he half expected to. "I'm obliged you didn't put that knife in me before I got the chance to help." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that some of the tightness went out of Gideon's chest. "You are fortunate my aim is worse with a swollen ankle." He allowed a short laugh at that, more from relief than humor, and set about binding the wound properly with strips torn from the clean cloth, while she directed him, precise and unembarrassed, on exactly how tight to wrap it and where the pressure needed to sit to slow the bleeding, without cutting off the blood beneath. In answer to a question he hadn't quite worked up the nerve to ask yet, she explained that she'd come into the canyon gathering yarrow and willow bark for the village elders, work she'd done since she was a girl at her mother's side, and that the rock slide had come down without any warning at all. No storm, no shifting she'd have expected, simply stone giving way above her as though something or someone had loosened it. That detail sat wrong with Gideon, the same wrongness that had followed him the whole ride out from the ranch, but he set it aside for the moment in favor of the more immediate problem sitting in front of him. "I'm hunting a chestnut stallion. 9 years I've had him, and he went missing off my ranch last night without so much as a broken rail to explain it." Something shifted in her expression, recognition plain. "I saw him this morning, before the rock came down. A chestnut, tall, a white mark here." She touched her own forehead to show him, crossing the wash beyond the far ridge, frightened but sound on his legs. "I thought at first he was wild." Relief and worry tangled together in Gideon's chest in about equal measure, the horse alive and unhurt, but plainly driven somewhere on purpose rather than wandered off by accident, which meant somebody had gone to real trouble over it. He looked at Ayasha's ruined ankle and made the only decision that felt like a decision at all. "He'll keep a while longer. You can't walk on that leg, and I'm not leaving you in this canyon to find out what put that rock down on you in the first place. We're getting out of here together." She opened her mouth as if to argue the point on principle. The way Gideon was already coming to understand she argued most things on principle, and then seemed to think better of wasting the breath, perhaps because her own eyes had already gone to the canyon walls rising close around them and found nothing in the shadows there that made staying look wiser than leaving. She let him help her up, testing her weight gingerly on the good leg, hissing sharp through her teeth when the bad ones so much as brushed the ground. And Gideon, without much ceremony about it, got an arm braced under her shoulders and walked her the short distance to where Samson stood waiting. Getting her up into the saddle took 2 tries and no small amount of gritted teeth patience on both their parts. Ayasha refusing outright to be lifted like a sack of grain, and Gideon refusing outright to let her attempt it unassisted on a leg that could barely bear her own weight, until they arrived at some unspoken middle compromise, where she braced against his shoulder and swung herself up while he steadied her from below. Once she was settled, he took Samson's lead rope in hand and started them walking, choosing to go afoot himself rather than crowd the saddle. And the two of them made their slow way back out through the canyon's narrow throat, with the light growing wider and warmer around them the further they went. If a story like this one is the reason you keep finding your way back to this channel, we'd be glad to call you part of it properly. Tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It costs very little, and it keeps stories exactly like Gideon and Ayasha's coming to you every week. They talked as they walked, careful at first and then less so, the way two strangers do once the worst of the danger has passed, and there's nothing left to fill the silence but conversation. Ayasha shared without much prompting the healing work she did for her people, plants and roots and barks. She'd learned to read the way another woman might read a book. Knowledge her mother had carried before her and her mother's mother before that, passed hand to hand down a line of women who had kept their village fed and mended through droughts and sickness. No trader's doctor ever rode far enough to treat. She described it plainly, without false modesty, and Gideon found himself listening the way he rarely listened to anyone, less interested in filling the quiet with his own voice than in hearing whatever she chose to say next. He shared in turn about the ranch, about 9 years of building something out of raw land and stubbornness, about a father who'd handed him a deed and precious little else in the way of guidance, and left him to work out the rest for himself. He kept quiet about the 2 women in Cottonwood Bend he'd turned away from, not because it seemed relevant, but because he genuinely hadn't thought of either of them once since riding into this canyon. A fact that struck him as worth noticing, even if he wasn't yet ready to examine why. Ayasha, for her part, pressed sharp, practical questions about cattle and water rights and the particular stubbornness of a rancher's life, the questions of someone genuinely curious rather than merely polite. And somewhere in the exchange of it, Gideon caught himself thinking that he had covered more honest ground with this woman in an hour than he generally managed with anyone in a season. They found Cavalier not long after clearing the canyon mouth, grazing peacefully in a meadow tucked below the ridge, unhurt and unbothered as though he'd simply wandered off to better grass. And the sight of him loosened something tight in Gideon's chest that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. He was moving to close the distance and catch up the lead rope when Ayasha's hand closed hard on his arm, her whole body gone suddenly rigid atop Samson's back, her eyes fixed on the far ridge line. "Riders." Her voice dropped low and urgent. "There. Do you see them?" Gideon followed her gaze and picked out the shapes against the skyline, 6 of them by his count, moving with a purpose that had nothing lazy or accidental about it, cutting a line straight for the ground where Cavalier's tracks would still be plain to read. "Could be anybody," he tried, though even as the words left his mouth, he didn't believe them himself. "They are not hunters, and they are not looking for cattle." Ayasha's voice had dropped to something flatter and harder than anything he'd heard from her yet. "Look how they ride the ground. They know exactly where they are going, and they are following the same tracks we followed in." The pieces Gideon had been refusing to fit together all morning slid abruptly into place, ugly and complete. Nobody unlatched a corral gate quiet in the night and led a valuable horse 9 miles into forbidden canyon country by accident. Somebody had wanted that stallion found in Apache territory, wanted a trail that led exactly where Gideon had just walked it, and the rock that came down on Ayasha with no storm and no warning to explain it looked considerably less like bad luck now, and a good deal more like men working with blasting powder who hadn't cared or hadn't known that a woman was gathering herbs beneath the ledge they were working. Whoever these riders were, they weren't hunting a stray stallion at all. They were hunting the one witness who'd seen something out here she wasn't meant to see. Under cover, Gideon was already moving, catching Cavalier's lead and pulling both horses back toward a stand of scrub brush and broken rock that offered at least some cover from the ridge above. Now, he got both animals settled and quieted as best he could manage, a hand on each muzzle, his own pulse hammering loud enough in his ears that he half expected the riders to hear it from a quarter-mile off. Ayasha sat rigid and silent in the saddle beside him, watching the ridge through the gap in the brush with an intensity that made plain she'd read this kind of danger before, and knew exactly how little margin they had if the search widened even slightly in their direction. The riders combed the open ground below the ridge for what felt to Gideon like the longest quarter hour of his life, fanning out, doubling back, one of them dismounting at one point to study the tracks Cavalier and Samson had left crossing toward the brush where they now hid, close enough that Gideon could make out the shape of the rifle slung across the man's back and the hard, businesslike set of his shoulders. It was Ayasha who broke first, not out of fear but out of decision, drawing a slow breath and putting 2 fingers to her lips. The sound that came out of her was sharp and clear and utterly unlike anything a bird would make, cutting across the canyon floor and echoing off the rock walls in a way that could not possibly have been mistaken for anything but what it was. A deliberate call sent out on purpose to be heard by someone specific. Gideon's stomach dropped, certain for one terrible second that she'd just announced their position to 6 armed strangers, and then he heard the answer come back from the far side of the valley. A whistle pitched almost identically to her own, and understood he'd misjudged the danger of the moment entirely. The riders on the ridge heard it too. Gideon watched them go still, watched the man who'd dismounted swing back up into his saddle in a hurry, watched the whole loose line of them turn as one toward the sound of hoofbeats now rising fast from the valley's far side, a sound that grew from a rumor to a certainty in a matter of seconds, as a line of Apache riders came around the shoulder of the ridge at a hard gallop, moving with the kind of coordination that made plain this was neither the first nor the 10th time they'd answered a call like Ayasha's. The 6 strangers did not stay to argue the point. They wheeled their horses hard and rode for open country at a pace that left no doubt at all about which side of that meeting they'd expected to lose. And within the space of a few frantic minutes, the ridge stood empty of everyone but the riders who belonged there. Ayasha let out a breath Gideon hadn't realized she'd been holding either, some of the rigid tension finally draining out of her shoulders, and when he looked at her, she was watching the approaching riders with an expression that had gone soft with relief in a way nothing else about this entire strange day had managed to produce. "My people," she breathed out simply, as though that explained everything. And in a way, Gideon supposed it did. The lead rider drew up hard in a spray of dust not 10 feet from where they'd emerged from cover. An older man with silver threading heavy through his hair and a bearing that needed no introduction to announce he was someone of consequence among his people. He was off his horse and at Ayasha's side before Gideon had fully processed the man's arrival. gathering her down out of the saddle into an embrace that carried the particular relief of a parent who had feared the worst and been spared it. Murmuring low in a language Gideon didn't understand, but recognized instantly for what it was. When the man finally turned to look at Gideon, his gaze was measuring, careful, the look of someone deciding in real time what to make of a stranger found alone with his daughter deep in canyon country. Ayasha explained quickly in her own tongue, gesturing at the canyon behind them, at her bound ankle, at Gideon standing awkward and uncertain a few respectful paces back. And whatever she gave him changed the older man's expression by degrees, the wariness softening into something closer to gratitude. You freed her from the rock. The man's English came careful and unhurried, each word tested before he committed to it. You could have ridden past. Many men would have. Didn't seem much like a choice to me. Gideon met his eyes plainly. She needed help. I had 2 hands free to give it. The older man studied him a long moment more, then extended his own hand in a gesture Gideon suspected didn't come naturally or often to him, and gripped Gideon's forearm firm when Gideon took it. You protected my daughter. For that you will always be welcome among our people. He glanced once at Ayasha, something warm passing between them that needed no translation at all, and Ayasha, watching Gideon over her father's shoulder, allowed herself the first full smile he'd seen from her since the canyon. My father, she offered, by way of introduction, is Chief Standing Elk. The ride back to the village took the better part of that afternoon. Ayasha carried now in a litter 2 of the younger riders rigged between horses at her father's insistence, over her own mild but clearly token protest that she was entirely capable of riding herself. Gideon led Cavalier alongside Samson, the stallion calm and unbothered now that he'd been recovered, and found himself the object of a good deal of frank, curious study from the riders around him. None of it unfriendly, all of it plainly reserving final judgment until they'd seen more of him than one afternoon's good deed. Chief Standing Elk rode near him for a stretch of the journey, asking careful questions about the ranch, about the missing horse, about how exactly Gideon had come to be riding into that particular canyon on that particular morning, and Gideon met every one of them straight, sensing correctly that half-truths would serve him considerably worse here than plain ones. By the time they came down into the village proper, evening light was spilling gold across a scatter of dwellings arranged along a stream lined with cottonwood. Children running out to meet the returning riders with the fearless curiosity of the very young, older villagers watching from their work with a more measured interest. Once word passed through that the chief's daughter had been found safe and a stranger had played some part in it, Gideon felt every eye on him as they rode in, and though none of it was hostile exactly, he understood well enough that he was a guest in the fullest sense of the word, present at the pleasure of people who owed him nothing beyond what courtesy demanded, and could withdraw that welcome as easily as they'd extended it. Ayasha's mother met them at the edge of the village, and whatever composure the chief had managed to hold on to through the ride home broke entirely at the sight of his wife's face. The 2 of them embracing their daughter together while Ayasha, laughing now despite the pain plainly still sharp in her ankle, waved off the idea that she was anywhere near death's door or needed quite so much fuss made over one bad rock slide. Gideon stood back through the reunion, holding both horses' lead ropes, feeling like exactly what he was, an outsider present for a moment that belonged to people who'd feared losing something precious and gotten it back. It was Ayasha, catching his eye over her mother's shoulder, who drew him back into the circle of it, describing to her parents plainly and without embellishment exactly what he'd done in that canyon, the lever, the branch, the strength it had taken to shift a stone that size, until her mother turned to him with tears standing fresh in her eyes and thanked him in words that needed no translation at all. Gideon meant to leave that same evening, mindful of Otis and the ranch, and a promise to be back by dark that he'd already broken several hours over. But the chief would not hear of it, certain that a man who'd earned this kind of welcome would insult the village by riding off into darkening country without so much as a meal and a night's proper rest. Gideon, weighing the very real danger of 6 armed men still somewhere out in that country against the chief's genuine hospitality, allowed himself to be persuaded and sent word instead with one of the younger riders bound for the trading post, a message he trusted would reach Otis by morning and spare the old foreman a sleepless night of worry. The meal that evening was generous beyond anything Gideon had expected. Roasted meat and mesquite bread and a stew rich with wild onion and squash, shared around a fire that drew most of the village close as the day's excitement settled into easier conversation. Gideon found himself seated near the chief, fielding questions about ranch life that seemed to genuinely interest the older man, and stealing glances across the fire at Ayasha often enough that he suspected, from the small knowing look her mother gave him at one point, that his interest had not gone entirely unnoticed. Ayasha herself seemed unbothered by the attention, meeting his eyes across the flames with a directness that carried none of the wariness she'd first shown him in that canyon. Replaced now by something warmer, something that made Gideon's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to admit. Before the fire burned down that night, Chief Standing Elk pressed a small leather pouch into Gideon's hands, finely worked and beaded along its edge, making plain it was not payment for anything, because what he'd done in that canyon wasn't the kind of thing a man could properly be paid for, but a reminder instead that this village would always count him a friend from that day forward. Gideon accepted it with more genuine feeling than he'd expected to have for a piece of leatherwork, understanding even then that the gift meant considerably more than its material worth, a door left open that most outsiders never once got the chance at. He rode home the next morning with Cavalier trotting easy alongside Samson, the leather pouch tucked careful in his saddlebag, and found himself thinking about Ayasha for most of the 2 hours it took to reach his own gate, turning the whole strange day over in his mind the way a man turns a coin he isn't sure yet whether to spend. Otis met him at the corral with a mixture of relief and mild reproach, listened to the full account of the missing horse in the canyon and the 6 armed riders with his eyebrows climbing steadily higher, and allowed once Gideon had finished that it was about the strangest and most fortunate string of trouble he'd ever heard one man walk through in a single day. Gideon did not stay away long. He reasoned with himself that the first return trip, less than a week later, was purely a matter of courtesy, a proper thank you owed to a chief who'd fed and sheltered him, and to a woman whose ankle he wanted to see mending well, and he brought with him a set of good steel tools he thought might serve the village better than whatever they were making do with, along with a sack of coffee and sugar he suspected weren't easy to come by out here. Chief Standing Elk received him with the same warmth as before, though Gideon noticed, not without some private amusement, that Ayasha's mother watched the two of them together with the particular attentiveness of a woman doing sums she hadn't yet shared aloud. Ayasha herself, ankle-wrapped but healing well, met him near the stream with a directness that made plain she'd been half expecting his return before he'd fully decided on it himself. "You came back." It wasn't quite a question. "Gave your father my word I would." Gideon fell into step beside her as she walked, slower than her usual pace, but steady enough now that she'd waved off the offer of a supporting arm. "Wanted to see for myself that ankle wasn't going to trouble you the rest of your days." "It mends." She glanced sideways at him, something testing in the look. "You rode 2 hours to check on an ankle." "Rode 2 hours because I found I didn't much want to wait longer than a week to see you again." Gideon let the honesty sit plain between them, deciding it had served him well enough with this family already that there was little sense abandoning it now. Figured the ankle was as good an excuse as any. Something flickered across her face at that, pleased despite herself, and though she offered no reply beyond a small private smile, the silence that followed carried none of the careful distance of that first wary afternoon in the canyon. They walked the length of the stream together while she described the healing work she'd resumed despite her mother's objections. About the plants that grew wild along this particular bend of water, and which of them her grandmother had first shown her how to use. And Gideon listened the way he'd found himself listening to her from that very first hour, more interested in the shape of her thoughts than in filling the space with his own. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them named aloud, but both understood plainly enough. Gideon found reasons to ride out to the village every week or two, sometimes bringing tools or supplies the village genuinely needed, sometimes bringing nothing at all beyond the honest wish to see Ayasha and her family again. And the chief, far from discouraging the visits, seemed to take a quiet, private satisfaction in watching them multiply. Gideon learned over those weeks more about Chiricahua ways than he'd absorbed in his whole prior life on that range. The proper courtesies owed to elders, the patience to sit through a ceremony as a respectful guest rather than a restless outsider, the real authority Ayasha's healing knowledge commanded in her village, sought out by families whose trust she'd earned the same careful way she'd earned Gideon's own. Ayasha, for her part, rode out to the edge of Gideon's own range more than once, curious about the cattle work he'd described to her that first day in the canyon, and proved herself, much to Otis's grudging admiration, entirely capable of reading a rain-heavy sky or a spooked animal's temper better than half the hands on the payroll. She teased Gideon mercilessly the first time he tried and failed to pronounce a word in her own language correctly, and endured his equally clumsy attempts at teaching her to rope a fence post with a patience that showed plainly she found his failures considerably more charming than she'd ever admit outright. Between them grew something built less on any single dramatic rescue and more on the steady accumulation of a dozen ordinary afternoons. Conversations that ranged easy from cattle prices to old grief to the particular stubbornness they each recognized readily in the other. One afternoon that autumn, Gideon rode out to find the village in the middle of preparing for a harvest gathering, cottonwood branches strung with dried corn and squash, children weaving between the cook fires underfoot, and Ayasha up to her elbows in the work of it, despite her mother's insistence that a chief's daughter needn't grind her own corn when a dozen hands stood ready to do it for her. Ayasha waved off the suggestion the same way she waved off most suggestions, that she sit quietly and be looked after, and Gideon, watching her laugh with two younger cousins over a joke he hadn't caught the words to, understood plainly that this was exactly the woman he'd first glimpsed in that canyon, fierce and capable and entirely unwilling to be handled with anything less than respect. She caught him watching and crossed the clearing to press a strip of roasted corn into his hand without a word of greeting, beyond a raised eyebrow that dared him to comment on the flour dusting her sleeves. And Gideon, grinning, decided he had never once in his life wanted to comment on anything less. It was Chief Standing Elk who raised it plainest, on an evening some 2 months after that first canyon afternoon, drawing Gideon aside from the fire while Ayasha helped her mother with the evening meal. "My daughter has never once looked at a man the way she looks at you." The chief watched Gideon's face closely for the reaction. "I have watched her turn away suitors from 3 bands who brought more in the way of horses and standing than you will ever bring to this fire. She did not want them. I think you already understand why." Gideon, caught somewhere between honesty and caution, chose honesty, the way this family had taught him honesty served best. "I think a great deal of your daughter, Chief. More than I've thought of any person and longer than I can rightly say. I won't pretend that isn't true, and I won't pretend I haven't wondered where it's headed." The chief studied him a long moment in the firelight, weighing something Gideon couldn't fully read, and then nodded slow, as though a private question had finally settled to his own satisfaction. "Then you have my blessing to find out, for whatever that is worth to a man who is not of my people. I did not give it lightly. I give it because a man who lifts a stone off a stranger's leg without asking what she is to him first, and keeps returning long after any debt is settled, has already shown me the truth of his heart better than words ever could." Gideon carried that conversation with him the rest of that evening and a good many after it. And when he finally found Ayasha alone by the stream some while later, the fire's noise faded to a low murmur behind them, and the sky gone deep and star-thick overhead. He laid it out plain, what her father had shared with him, and what he himself had come, over 2 months of ordinary afternoons, to understand about his own heart. Ayasha listened without interrupting, the same close attention she'd given him that very first day in the canyon. And when he finished, she reached for his hand, unhurried and certain, lacing her fingers through his own in a gesture that needed no further explanation from either of them. "I did not expect," she began quietly, "that the man who freed me from that rock would be the one who kept me from wanting to be anywhere else. Didn't expect it myself." His voice went rough with feeling he made no attempt to hide from her now. "Rode into that canyon looking for a horse. Found the whole rest of my life instead." She laughed, soft and real, and leaned her head against his shoulder in a gesture of trust that would have seemed impossible to the wary, knife-drawn woman he'd first found pinned beneath that stone. And the two of them sat together a long while by the water, in a silence that carried nothing wary in it at all. Only the quiet, settled certainty of two people who had found in each other something neither had known they were still looking for. The friendship between the ranch and the village only deepened in the seasons that followed, old suspicions on both sides giving slow but steady ground to the plainer evidence of trust honestly earned. Chief Standing Elk's people came to know Gideon's ranch hands by name, and Otis, gruff as he was about most things, developed a genuine respect for the villagers who occasionally rode out to trade fair goods for fair goods, no different in his eyes than any other honest neighbor, as he grudgingly allowed more than once. Word of the 6 riders who'd driven off a rancher's horse to lure him into blame and danger reached the territorial authorities eventually, carried there by Gideon himself, who testified plainly to what he'd witnessed and left little room for anyone to pretend the trouble had started on the Apache side of that canyon. Gideon had set out that first morning chasing nothing grander than a missing stallion, certain the whole matter would resolve itself within a day's hard riding and be forgotten within a season. He recovered Cavalier exactly as he'd set out to do, and the horse carried him faithfully many years more, none the worse for his brief adventure into forbidden country. But the greater discovery of that single strange day, the one Gideon carried with him long after the details of 6 fleeing riders and one dramatic rescue had softened into the comfortable shape of a story shared often around a fire, was the woman he'd found pinned beneath that stone, and the whole unexpected life that had opened up around them, both because one man decided, in the space of a held breath, that a stranger's danger was worth making his own. What began as a search for something lost ended, in the truest sense, as the discovery of something neither Gideon nor Ayasha had known they were searching for at all. If you want more stories like theirs, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member today. It's what keeps this whole channel riding, one story at a time.